Hello, everybody. I hope you are fine. This is Jane Eyre theme of class distinction. Class distinction in the novel Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte appears mainly in two stages of her life. Her life in Gateshead with her uncle's widow, Mrs. Reed, and her work as a governess at Rochester's mansion. Jane Eyre as a novel is critical of Victorian England's strict social hierarchy or social class structure or system, which divides people according to their social class. The first case of class discrimination or class distinction is seen during Jane's stay at Gateshead Hall. Mrs. Reed and her children, particularly John, treat Jane as an inferior or someone below their social standard because Jane is a dependent poor relation. By dependent, we mean that she has no independent economic resource, but she relies on them in providing for her livelihood. Mrs. Reed gathers with her children around the fireplace, dismissing Jane because she is poor. John Reed, Jane's cousin, always humiliates and strikes Jane, particularly in the incidents when Jane takes a book of his bookshelves. Bessie and Abbott, the two servants at Mrs. Reed's home, disapprove Jane's conduct of answering back John Reed because they consider him the master of the house. And Jane is a kind of servant or less than servant who must obey her master. Jane rejects or refuses calling him master, claiming that she is not a servant. But Bessie explains to her that she is less than a servant because she doesn't work in order to provide for herself. Bronte's exploration or depiction of the complicated social position of the governess is perhaps the novel's most important treatment of the theme of class discrimination. Jane is a figure of ambiguous class standing, or Jane's social class constitutes a riddle or a problem for her society. So that there is much tension around her or much conflict around her. Of course, this doesn't refer to Jane in particular, but it's the general problem of the category of governess at that time. The problem with the governess and Jane is that her manners, sophistication, or progress and higher education are those of an aristocrat. Because Victorian governess or teachers who tutored or taught children in etiquette as well as academics were expected or were supposed to possess or to have the culture of the aristocracy. Yet, on the other way round, the governess was considered a paid employee, so that she must be treated as a servant because she lived in the house of her master and received her salary as any servant did. Jane remains penniless or without any money and powerless or deprived of any form of power while being at Thornfield Hall with Edmund Rochester. Jane herself speaks out against class prejudice or class bias at certain moments in the book. For example, in chapter 23, she rebukes Rochester or blames him. Do you think because I am poor, obscure, غامضة, يعني not known, plain, مقبولة الشكل, and little, I am soulless, بلا روح, and heartless, بلا قلب? You think wrong. I have as much soul as you, and full as much heart. And if God had gifted me with some beauty and much wealth, I should have made it as hard for you to leave me as it is now for me to leave you. So that in this quotation, Jane denies the fact that the poor has no soul or heart to feel because of poverty. Instead, she asserts that there is equality between the rich and the poor in having human feelings. And she supposes that if she has wealth, she will be equal to Rochester. However, it's also important to note that nowhere in Jane Eyre are society's boundaries bent, which means the boundaries or the limitations of every social class is very firm, very strong, can't be transcended. Ultimately or eventually, في النهاية, Jane is only able to marry Rochester as his social equal because she has almost magically came into her own inheritance from her dead uncle. When Jane is poor, she fails to marry Rochester. But when she becomes rich, only then she becomes his social equal, and only then their love story ends happily by their marriage. So, the author of the novel, Charlotte Bronte, emphasized the fact that the British society has firm social hierarchy, which is impossible to be transcended. Thanks for watching and goodbye.